rich people, always flying off somewhere.
Welcome to the Vegan Vanguard,
a show about all things from the perspective of two revolutionary vegan women.
I'm Mexi.
And I'm Maureen. And in today's show, we'll be bringing you a laminated blueprint for how to end capitalism and what to build in its place.
Yeah, and it'll be laminated because this is the only way that it can possibly be
The
done.
ultimate.
This is the only solution, and of course we have discovered it, and we're just going to pass it out like a pamphlet, and everyone
I just
can
cannot
follow
believe
this.
we haven't thought about this before.
Yeah. Well, we got so many questions asking us, what's the alternative, guys? Tell me now, what's the alternative? And we thought, well, okay, we better come up with a foolproof, really well thought out alternative. And that's that. So,
Well, otherwise we're really not allowed to speak about the prodigy that is capitalism.
right. Yeah. Otherwise, we're just super naive
Yeah.
and, need to just be quiet. So,
Mhm.
so we solved that.
Good. Great. I'm so happy to get this out of the way.
Yeah.
No, but the reason we're being quite sassy about this is because I feel like there's a half of the comments, or more than half of the comments, that are not asking in a well-intentioned way, right? That just sort of want to silence us. So that's why they're being like, well, you can't criticize capitalism as long as you come up with an alternative. But then I do think that some of the comments are more well-intentioned that are just saying, like, what's the alternative? Like, I do think that we need to talk about alternatives, and it is important. And it is like really, it is hard.
I mean, there's even a ton of leftists who are like fully on the anti-capitalist train being like, okay, but how do we organize this? How do we do that? So these are
Right.
conversations we should be having. But like A, we should be having them in like good faith. And B, we should be thinking of them as, collaborative conversations that we need to be having to build out some of these ideas in the present day. It shouldn't just be like, okay, well, here's the solution. This one person thought of it. Like, so anyway, we're gonna get into all that today.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are looking for models to follow instead of trying to create something in capitalism's place.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah, like we can't just be looking for this one magical thing that we can follow. We have to actually understand that we ourselves are the creators of this. So like we need to start imagining, we need to start building, we need to start talking and working together. I think that's such a great way to put it.
Yeah, I think it also comes from this myth that capitalism is just like this one thing and it's responsible for everything we've got up until this point. So how are we just going to sub it with something else? It comes from I think a deep misunderstanding of what capitalism is.
Yeah, that's a very good segue, perhaps, into the definition.
Oh, yes. So, Mexi, I was wondering, what is capitalism exactly?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Maureen, because unlike what some people may think, that, capitalism is this voluntary interaction between two willing parties that exchange services and both mutually benefit from the exchange of those services. Capitalism is actually a mode of production. Capitalism, socialism, anarchism, all of these isms are all different modes of production. So they're based around things like property rights and means of production and the way that profits are generated and surplus is distributed. So each one of them can take many different forms. Like capitalism is often associated with like liberal democracies. However, there have been and continue to be many capitalist dictatorships. Like there's no one form that any of these things necessarily have to take. So capitalism is a mode of production based around the private ownership of the means of production and distribution of goods and services. This grew out of feudalism in England through a series of private land enclosures where land was enclosed and the peasants that were working the land were forced to leave. They were evicted. And so since they no longer had access to that land or means of producing for themselves, they were then forced to sell their labor for a wage. So this is what we call primitive accumulation. And this is the process through which people are turned into the laboring class because they have no access to the means of producing anything for themselves. They can't support themselves other than through selling their labor for a wage and then buying things that they used to be able to produce for themselves. So capitalism therefore functions as a system where there's a capitalist class or the owners of capital and the means of production, such as property, equipment, etc. And they spend that capital and money and hire laborers to produce commodities that will be sold for a higher amount than the money that was initially invested. And so this additional value is produced by the workers, who are the ones who actually combine the raw materials into commodities and produce this higher value. But workers are not paid that full value of all the time they put in for their social labor. And this is how profits are made. And of course, the profits are taken by the capitalist. So capitalism does not function without this class hierarchy and exploitation of labor. And in order to compete with other capitalists, each firm must also strive to increase efficiency and profit generation in order to reinvest in increased production and efficiency, because capital is really just capital in motion. Like it's only capital if you're going to reinvest it to produce more capital. Otherwise, it's just money and like wealth, right? But when the markets are saturated, the main way to increase profits is to lower the cost of production, which means putting a downward pressure on labor and wages and cutting corners environmentally. Or in other words, the social and environmental costs of capitalist accumulation or competition are externalized. And this is why we see increasing inequality and environmental degradation as inherent parts of capitalist accumulation. So these are not accidents. These are things that happen based on the inner mechanisms of capitalism as a mode of production itself. And as I said, capitalism can take many different forms, being dictatorship, a quote-unquote liberal democracy.
Capitalism is not synonymous with democracy, unlike so many people think.
Yeah, absolutely not. It is not. That is like a very good point that needs to be underscored, that, yeah, it could be anything. And even like, I mean, we can do a whole other podcast about like the quote-unquote democracy that we enjoy in liberal capitalist democracies, but that's a different story.
Yes. Thank you for that explanation. It was very insightful and super concise. I feel like our listeners are going to have to go back and play it and listen to it and be like, yes. That's what I do with a lot of podcasts. I'm just like, wait, this was really good information. But I think we also need to, understand that like the economy or capitalism is not just an objective science of just like, well, you know, certain people pursue profits and then exploitation is inherent to it. And so like, I think that's definitely a part of it. But I think that what people also fail to see is that like the World Trade Organization and the structures, the institutions that structure the flow of resources actually have a huge impact on like how that flow operates. So it's really, it's an economic model, and it's also like a model for maintaining inequality between different countries and regulating the flow of production.
Yeah, for sure. Because like if you just look at what I just said about the inherent mechanisms of capitalism, like profits are produced through inequality. Like profits do not get produced without inequality. So a lot of these things that are here now in late stage capitalism are, these political mechanisms for increasing that and maintaining that upward flow of money from the bottom to the top.
Yeah. So next I want to dispel the myth, like once and for all, that capitalism is working and is reducing inequality, because the World Bank and just a lot of people, a lot of important people have been peddling this myth that inequality on a global scale is getting better with capitalism. And it's not. And I looked into this a little bit more. And that myth is actually based on extremely misleading stats. And they're misleading for two main reasons. The first is that, the stats are calculated as if everybody in the world is part of like one big country. and even then it's only so if you consider like that everyone is part of one big country, it is true. But that's only if you include China and East Asia in the mix. And interestingly enough, they're the only parts of the world that haven't been forcibly globalized by the Washington Consensus, established in the 1980s. So they were able to transform their economy largely according to their own standards. However, if we look at global inequality between different regions of the world, so like across rich and poor countries or north and south, what we see is that inequality has gotten much, much worse. And actually the income gap between the poor and the rich in the last few decades has tripled. So that's why that's one reason why it's incredibly misleading. We definitely see that wealth is being massively transferred from the south to the north. And okay, the other factor that makes this stat misleading is so the UN says there's about 700 million to 1 billion poor people in the world, and that number has been decreasing steadily. However, they put the threshold for what qualifies as poverty at $1.25 a day, which is ridiculous because no one can actually live on that. It's estimated by a lot of economists that the basic level of human subsistence can only be achieved with at least $5 a day. Okay, so that's like if you want to be able to like drink and eat and live past like your second birthday. And if you look at that stat of $5 a day, there's actually 4.3 billion people in the world living in poverty. So that's quite a massive difference. So the yields of capitalism are very much going to the rich countries. And obviously the rules of capitalism are regulated in a way that's beneficial to them. And another interesting stat is that all of the new income generated in the past few decades, out of all of that income, only 5% has gone to the poorest 60% of the world. So trickle down my ass at this rate of trickling down. Economists actually estimate that it would take over 200 years to eradicate poverty. But that's like considering, doing as if we wouldn't blow ourselves up if we kept going this way for 200 years, which we would. So it's like an unrealistic statistic anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Like the World Bank also incredibly doctored their stats on poverty. It makes me so mad when people say that poverty is being reduced. Because they're the institution that's supposed to be eradicating poverty. So it looked pretty bad for them where like decade after decade after decade, poverty was increasing. Even I just read Joseph Stiglitz, his new book, Globalization and Its Discontents, but the original version of that was written prior. I can't remember when exactly it was written, but he was doing a lot of the research during the 90s. And even in that book, he talks about how, despite the rhetoric of the World Bank, he was the former head of the World Bank, chief economist of the World Bank, by the way, so he knows what he's talking about. He was saying that poverty had actually increased over the 90s, like a significant amount. And this is the head of the World Bank. And then suddenly the tables are turned. Like we move into the 21st century and suddenly the world's getting so much better despite like the Washington Consensus policies that destroyed everything, despite neoliberalism. Suddenly it's getting better. And everyone's like, oh wow, great, capitalism is like finally working. It's like, really? You think that it all of a sudden just switched from getting so much worse to being immediately better? I'll include an article in the show notes talking about how they actually, changed the goalposts and how it didn't align with inflation and how, like the stats that they use made it seem as though overnight, all of a sudden, all these people are no longer in poverty, whereas really the problem is just as bad as before, if not way worse. So it really makes me sick when I see people like the Bill Gates Foundation and like just anyone online telling me that like, well, everything is getting so much better. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, fuck.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that one of the most destructive myths that we tell ourselves about capitalism in the West, in rich countries, is that rich countries are just, they're doing incredibly well because they're very smart and because they're very hardworking. But we're the ones who are actually very generous and who give a lot of aid to the poor countries, right? This whole like myth of international aid. And actually international aid, so if we look at the budget, it's actually a lot of money. It's 130 billion per year that goes from north to south.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, the thing is that there's way more flowing from south to north.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really poor countries that are developing rich countries in a sense. But that's just thought of as like, well, that's just really good business when they're forced to give us all of our wealth. However, it's like aid when we give them, when money goes from north to south. But I think that's like one of the most pervasive and harmful myths that people need to understand. And
sorry, yeah, absolutely. I was watching, I don't know if you know this, but Mad Blender did a debate with the vegan cheetah the other day. Yeah.
Oh my God, poor Mad Blender.
I know. So anyways, well, I was watching it live and I was commenting whatever, and he was saying all of that stuff that you're just talking about. And it like he obviously thinks that the real problem is like the elite Jews that are running everything.
Oh God.
He actually commented to me like, Mexi, are you denying that the elite Jews are not the ones running the World Bank and whatever? And I was just like, oh my God, fuck off. But like,
please refer to what, our third podcast?
Please refer to like any information ever. Like just do some reading that's not like Breitbart news or whatever, you know? But yeah, those are the common talking points, especially with this like rise of the alt-right, is that like, well, Western civilizations just work really hard and we're just really, really smart and we just earned all of this and everyone else is just too backwards to get it together and that's why they're poor and that's why we shouldn't have them immigrate. It's just like, oh man.
Yeah. So actually there was a comprehensive study, like the most comprehensive study like in the world, which we can link it in the show notes, that was done in December of 2015 by an association called the Global Financial Integrity Association or something that partnered with the Norwegian School of Economics to study the financial flows around the world. And they found that for every $1 of aid that African countries receive, they lose $24 in net outflows.
Yeah.
And that's through like a bunch of illicit financial flows where like companies are basically just like taking money from poor countries and storing it in tax havens, or like misinvoicing their profits.
Did you read that on an article is in the Guardian called Aid in Reverse? Is that what you're looking at?
No, actually a lot of these stats I'm getting from a podcast, from the Under the Skin podcast by Russell Brand, because like isn't that weird? Did you know that I love Russell Brand? Anyway, the podcast is called Inequality is Killing Us All. Are we going to stop it? And it's with guest Jason Hickel. It's amazing. Okay. I really love this episode, so we'll link it in the show notes. But so you read it somewhere else too?
Yeah, I'll link also the Guardian article. It's like just a very concise showing how aid is we should stop conceptualizing aid as like actually doing anything to develop the global south, because it's really set up for this global south to keep funneling their money and resources and everything to the global north.
Right. I mean, when we think about it, if we didn't regulate the flows of cash around the world according to like some fictitious social construct like money, why would it make sense that the countries producing all of the like material concrete resources are the poorest ones? Like how has our imagination been like so brainwashed and colonized that we actually think that makes sense?
Yes, so fucking colonized. Like it boggles my mind. I don't understand how that makes sense. It boggles my mind.
Yeah, no, it really does. It's we've completely normalized and like naturalized the idea that just African countries and other countries in the global south are just poor, even though we know that they're the ones giving us all of the resources.
It just
Like
boggles me
what?
because I'm like, I feel like I never believed that. Like, I feel like even when I was a child, I never believed that. So I'm just like, I'm looking around and I'm just like, am I like losing it? You know what I mean? Like, am I just like
But
what?
you were just like a very woke child, I feel like.
But I mean, even today,
But yeah, no, you're right. Like literally a 2-year-old would understand this. Like
right? Like even today, I'm
why?
looking around and I'm just like, who are all these normies? Like, I'm just
Right.
like, or like, am I the like, really weird one who's just missing something? But I'm just like, no, no. Like, I feel like this is very easy to understand.
Right.
I don't know.
But I mean, this message is pushed on us literally 500 times a day. So
I know, but man, I just still am like, just
yeah.
sidebar, we don't have to include this, but like just a funny thing about like I just, obviously recently joined OkCupid just like for the hell of it to
Oh,
see.
girl, we're including this.
Okay, fine. Okay, so just like a funny tangent. So as you know, I've just recently joined OkCupid as like
I do.
a funny like just to like see what it's about and like see who's out there. And I made my profile like super polarizing. It was like it's like I even said at the starting, I'm like, I'm gonna make this as polarizing as possible so that only the dopest of the dope
Yeah.
message me. So I'm like, hit me up if you, and then I have like a bulleted list, and it's like
Hmm.
are critical of capitalism, bonus points for like Marxist analysis, are
Hmm.
anti-imperialist, are feminist, are like all the shit, right?
Hmm. I
Um,
would hit you up, girl.
yeah. But yeah, and I kind of figured that I wouldn't get like too many messages. I don't know.
Oh,
I've
girl, so
gotten
many people on there are just hungry and don't give a fuck.
honestly, I've gotten like a billion messages.
Hmm.
And a lot of them will like kind of be like, "Oh yes, I'm a Marxist and I'm a feminist or whatever." But then you start talking to them and you realize that like they don't really know what they're talking about. But even
Hmm.
an even greater number than that are just sending me these messages that are just like so either clued out or who are like, haha, like you're fucked, or like you are wearing so many things in your picture that are made by capitalism. And I'm just like,
Hmm.
who am I surrounded by? Like, you know what I mean? I'm just like, are you like, would you actually ever say that as a real argument? Like, that just shows that you've done no thinking.
No
What's
thinking.
no
Yeah.
thinking whatsoever about the situation that you're in, about the systems around you. Even now when I'm saying you should be critical of capitalism, you're not even going to take this moment to do any reflection at
Right.
all. You're just going to say
Yeah.
that. I'm just
Yeah.
like, I can't even respond to that. Like, I don't, people are just like, oh, you don't want your views challenged. I'm like, but that's not a challenge. That's ridiculous. Like, I don't have
Hmm.
time for that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I'm just like, everyone's mind is so colonized. It really made me actually feel, I've only been on there for like 2 days, but actually
Hmm.
just like the number of messages that I got that were just so like strange like that, I'm just like, wow, it just really made me feel like I am just the odd person out of like my entire city and like possibly my entire country because everyone's
Yeah.
mind is so fucking colonized.
I know. It's the scare. I mean, we're laughing about it now, but that those are the times when I get just so discouraged and
Mm-hmm.
just like upset, you know?
Yeah.
But that being said, and we're going to talk about like the solutions later on, but just briefly, I do feel like there's less and less people who believe in capital. Like I feel like there's no one left to defend this stuff, like and really honestly believe like that privatization is the way, that like indebting other like third world countries is ethical. Like I do feel like there is a certain crisis arising where there's just no one left to defend the system anymore except for these like 8 rich people who
Mm-hmm.
govern like 60% of the wealth or whatever the fuck that crazy stat is. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know. Sometimes I'm optimistic and sometimes I'm not.
Yeah, you're right. I mean I am optimistic. I mean this is the first time in my life that I'm seeing a lot more people actually like openly organizing and openly talking about socialism and like
Hmm.
so yeah, this is definitely like a unique moment. But then I also it's also just very discouraging like
Oh yeah,
what a
absolutely.
great job those like 8 wealthy people are doing in like building all of these right-wing think tanks and like
Hmm.
getting all these neo-Nazis on board and
Hmm.
you know what I mean? So, but
Hmm.
anyway,
Definitely.
yeah.
So to come back to my point that capitalism is not some objective science, that the economy is not objective, and I think people really need to understand that. That a lot of
It's
the
a set of
capital,
social relations.
absolutely, that a lot of the flow of capital is regulated largely by the WTO, which is such a profoundly anti-democratic body. Not only do rich countries control 50% of the WTO, but the US government has a veto on every single decision that's made there. So I think that obviously they're going to structure the flow of capital in a way that benefits them. And these stats that I was citing earlier, that all of the money from the South is basically being hemorrhaged into the North, this is very much orchestrated by the WTO and the rich countries themselves.
Yeah, the US and the EU and Japan, like the triad economies also similarly dominate the World Bank and the IMF. Like they make the decisions in terms of all of that, like lending, Washington consensus policies, etc. So this is all being structured by an elite few.
Totally. And it just has had like a huge impact on like our history. So this whole myth of international aid has very much indoctrinated us with the belief that all North countries want to do is like help the global South, and it's just like, I don't know, because they're so incompetent or because the resources are so scarce, like it's just really hard. Sorry, I don't know why I'm getting so sassy and mad. But yeah, I mean, the origins of mass poverty, like the one that we have around today, really is like started under colonialism. And actually, after colonialism ended, the rich countries really made sure that all of the poor countries, economically poor countries, would stay indebted to us forever. So you would think that in the 1970s, in the 2 decades after colonialism ended, there was so much resistance in the global South, and they elected a lot of leftist leaders. They implemented tariff protections and nationalized their own industries, redistributed land. Like it was really kind of a miracle of just like of recovery. You would think that the WTO, that's apparently tasked with like regulating the world economy so that it's as fair as possible, would be thrilled. However, they were not. And they literally, the global North, like the G7 countries, literally sat down together and were like, okay, how are we going to stop developmentalism? Like, how are we going to crush this resistance? And what they settled on was that the rich countries settled agreements with the IMF that the IMF would pay off, like basically bail out African countries in exchange, like only if they accepted structural adjustment programs that would liberalize their economy and privatize their assets, lower all of their environmental regulations, like basically allow northern countries to recolonize their entire economy. So that was a way to bail them out, but to keep them so much more indebted in the long run. And actually, if you look at how much debt they've had to pay, they've actually like paid it off a million times over already. But the fact that there's like compounded interest rates and that it keeps getting more and more difficult to pay back, and that banks, have imposed all of these like free trade regulations and austerity measures, keeps them like economically enslaved, basically.
So, well, yeah, and I mean they have to pay like all of their GDP, they have to pay like 40% of that back in debt repayments. So they have even they don't have money for healthcare, education, or things that would actually help to develop their citizens or their country, because they're literally paying like half of their money just to these fucking debt repayments,
Right. And like getting the other half stolen by corporations.
Right. Yeah.
That are setting up like tax havens.
Yeah. Or just leakage, just like foreign companies there, like the majority of profits go to them and the laborers get like piddly shit,
Right. So that's an example of how social democracy was actually flourishing and helping African nations have more independence and have more wealth at a shockingly rapid and almost miraculous rate. But it was torn down by, neoliberal capitalist assholes. So you're also, Mexi, I think, going to talk about how we have been sold this revisionist history of communism in Eastern Europe.
Hmm. Yeah, and everywhere, like in Cuba, etc. Um, so yeah, I mean, some of the some of the arguments that you'll hear against communism are that so many people died, like everyone fucking was murdered, like every like just everyone was dying, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And also that life expectancy and quality of life has increased so much under capitalism, and so therefore it's the only option for us. First of all, I mean, there has been so much said about the like black book of communism, which has been completely disproven, and yet people just still like hark on these numbers. But anyway, like if people dying is the benchmark for a shitty system, then I'm
Yeah, which it
sorry.
should be.
Yeah, but I'm like, well, then I'm sorry, why are none of the crimes of capitalism actually attributed to capitalism
Mm-hmm.
itself? Like the war crimes of Bush and Cheney and Reagan and everyone, famine in Africa while food is being exported, like billions going hungry while we overproduce food. I'm sorry, why is that not attributed to capitalism?
Mm-hmm.
Like all of the deaths of left-wing groups everywhere at the hands of the CIA, all of the coups, and then everyone who died during, the aftermath of the structural adjustment programs. We installed dictatorships across the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in order to promote this economic model, and I'm sorry, that's not part of capitalism. These are not deaths that should be attributed to capitalism. And what about capitalist dictators that have killed fucking everybody? You know what I mean? So it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so
Yes.
does that mean that capitalism is also the worst fucking system? And I think this goes back to the problem of people thinking that capitalism is just linked to democracy and not understanding that these are all modes of production that can be run under any
Mm-hmm.
number of different governance structures. And so it's like, yeah, like the existence of, you know, totalitarianism or death or whatever, like this is not exclusive to either capitalism or communism. Like the difference though is that capitalism is a system that is based around inequality and the production of inequality for profit, whereas alternatives are based around social need and communal ownership and like communal redistribution. um so yeah, I mean, like famines in India under British colonial rule. I mean, that should be a crime of capitalism. Like there have
Mm-hmm.
been an incredible amount of politically motivated famines under capitalism. So it's just people talk about these things with like little self-reflection at
Mm-hmm.
all, or like little reflection on the system that has produced so many more deaths. I think actually Bad Mouse did a video about the death toll of capitalism as kind of like a
Mm.
response to the death toll of communism or whatever. But yeah, that's just something that really bothers me.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, people saying that like, oh well, like life expectancy has risen. Similarly, in that vegan cheetah debate, people were saying, but like the colonizers helped Africa because life expectancy grew and their quality of life increased. Like
Mm-hmm.
they
The
brought,
big talking point in France is that they built their middle class
yeah, yeah,
and
like,
gave them roads.
yeah, someone said that to me too. Like, what about all their roads? And I'm just like, Jesus Christ.
Like they can't eat the fucking roads, okay? Or
I
the
know.
canals that actually brought the malaria.
Seriously. Yeah.
But what about irrigation?
Yeah. But even that argument is like, okay, well, life expectancy under the Soviet Union rose from 32 years before the revolution to 68 after Stalin's death, which at that
Damn.
time was a year more, like a year more than the life expectancy in the US. So, oh, I'm sorry, if life expectancy and standards of living are the benchmark of a great system, then is that not the best system in the world? You know what I mean? Like people just talk about these things with no nuance and like really
Hmm.
not like yeah, people just are not looking at these things as modes of production that can take different forms. And
Hmm.
they're not looking at like, well, what are the benefits of taking this form? um
Hmm.
Similarly, under Cuba, like life expectancy rose, illiteracy has been eradicated. Life expectancy is like the same as in the US, even though they are a poor nation. And remember that they have also been sanctioned and embargoed and basically forced to, be self-sufficient as a country. So, how many other countries could actually make that transformation and actually survive to the degree
Mhm.
that they have? Their healthcare is amazing. They export doctors around the world. They export doctors to the US. And they were the ones, Cuba and Venezuela were the two countries that rushed to Puerto Rico's aid when they were having the disaster. So it's just like, I'm sorry, this is a huge failure across the board. Like obviously we have to look at like human rights abuses, we have to look at the quality of democracy, etc. But it's like, how are people calling these things complete disasters and like not actually looking at what's going on? Like under Mao in China, life expectancy rose from 35 to 65. Like they took these backwards peasant countries and turned them into the two biggest superpowers in the world, Russia and China. So,
Mhm.
what? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying, like, obviously, we're not saying that everything was rosy dozy and that nobody died. Like, that's horrific that so many people died. But also, like, those were terrible policy mistakes. Like, even, like, no one's gonna, like, geniuses make mistakes. You know what I mean? So we have to look at, like, okay, that was bad. We don't want that. We don't really want, like, secret police running around killing everybody. But
Mhm.
we do want free healthcare for all. We do want illiteracy eradicated. We do want everyone having housing and food, which they all did.
Mhm.
Like even Joseph Stiglitz in his book, he has a whole chapter on like the Soviet system and the neoliberal aftermath. Same with Dr. Godzi. I was listening to a podcast recently where she was talking about, the devastation that happened in those countries, well, in Russia and in Eastern Europe, when the World Bank and the Western powers came in and basically forced them to liberalize their economies and adopt like neoliberal capitalism, and how fucking horrible that was for everybody because everyone they went from a system of full employment, full everyone had housing, everyone had healthcare, everyone had food, like infrastructure was all organized. They went from that to this system of quote unquote freedom where nobody could
Mhm.
actually afford to buy what they needed to live anymore. And that's the difference, And even Joseph Stiglitz, like he was saying how fucking like the whole thing is about how horrible the neoliberal aftermath was. And he is not a leftist, by the way. He is like former head of the World Bank or whatever. It was a bit contradictory though, because he was saying all these things that like the Soviet Union had, and that they turned this backward peasant country into this industrial global superpower that was making the US like tremble and so scared that they had to go out and do all of these like counter-revolutionary things and promote these structural adjustment programs. And it's like that was a huge failure. You know what I mean? Like I'm not sure, you know what I mean? Anyway, I think the point is that we have to like look at things in a much more nuanced way, look at what was working, and then how can we implement that in today's world, because conditions are so different today. So
Mhm.
again, we can't just like take a blueprint. Like nobody is suggesting today that we just take the blueprint of the Soviet Union and say, okay, we're just going to do exactly that. That wouldn't even work. We're not a
Mhm.
peasant society here in Canada. Like we would have totally different needs. We would have to do so many different things to organize a communal democratic society, right? So it's like we need to be building these things today, but we already have a lot of examples of things that were working for people, that we can draw from
Mhm.
and work to build the future.
Totally. And even if someone did have the answer, there is no one answer for different region for all these different regions of the world. Like
Mm-hmm.
we, I think, need local solutions that are collectively conceived of. We
Mm-hmm.
can't, I mean, arguably that's like one of the problems when you're talking about like, Russia. We don't want one person with all of the power. We don't want,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's like we have to start thinking about, what we want as a society, and then how can we build things around that? Like I was listening to an interview with David Harvey recently, and he was talking about Castro and about how he was basically like lambasting the US because the US was saying that, Cuba was such a horrible place and they had so many human rights abuses and whatever. And Castro was saying, well, I mean, like, not to excuse like any rights abuses that did go on, but he was talking about how, well, our idea of human rights is very different than the Western, like you're trying to impose your idea of human rights onto us, whereas we have a different vision of what human rights means. Like
Hmm.
for America, human rights is like are these
Like
abstract,
individual consumption
right, like
rights.
individualism, like freedom of speech, freedom of whatever, but just these
Like you
abstract,
can work your entire life and then buy half of the car.
right. Yeah, freedom to starve. Um,
Hmm.
Whereas in Cuba, he was saying, well, our ideas of human rights are everyone has housing, our rights to healthcare, our rights to education, free education, our rights to, you know what I mean? It's like
Hmm.
our idea of rights is very different. Like ours are more material based, where everyone is actually taken care of, and yours are more, pie in the sky. Everyone's free, but you're not guaranteed shit. And like, who cares if you starve in the street? That's your own fault, you know?
Hmm.
So I don't know. We have to start like it's more than just kind of trying to think about the blueprints. We also have to think like a bit more philosophically about, yeah, what do we mean by human rights? What do we want to structure our society around? And then how do we make that happen? You know?
Hmm.
I also think that we have to look at the role of like sanctions and imperialist pressure on all of these different countries as a major, you know, reason why they were facing many challenges that they were facing. And even today, countries under strict sanctions and embargoes, like how in the fuck do you think that a country is supposed to survive that? I mean, the point of these sanctions and these actions are to make them cave, or to make things so bad in that country that they have to cave and accept
Hmm.
economic imperialism, World Bank coming in, regime change. That's the point of all these things. So, if a capitalist country is being slapped with the same sanctions, embargoes, outright aggression and threats of attack, like how do you think that they would fare? You know what I mean? Especially like a poorer
Right.
country in Africa. Like there's always this joke because people always say like, if you love communism so much, why don't you move to Venezuela? Which isn't even socialist, by the way. It's like 70% privately owned, and like it's very obvious that the CIA is behind like wanting regime change there very badly, and they're working towards it through sanctions, etc. Um, but then I don't know. I always find it funny. Like I've heard this joke where it's like, okay, well, if you love capitalism so much, why don't you move to Somalia, or like, why don't you move to Bangladesh? Like, you know what I mean? It's just like,
Hmm.
oh yeah, like
Yeah.
I don't know. Um, but yeah, anyway, Dr. Godzi in this podcast that I was listening to made this great analogy that I wanted to share. Um, she said, or she was talking about, imagine that I am a young girl. I'm sitting here, I'm trying to build this tower out of blocks. And I'm building and I'm building and I'm getting really close to the top. But before I can finish, my brother runs over and knocks the whole thing down. And then I think, oh shit, all right, I'm gonna try this again. So I start again, I start building it up, and once again, right when I'm right near the top, my brother comes over and knocks the shit down. And I'm like, oh fuck. And I do it again. This keeps happening. And then my mom comes over and is like, oh, well, there must be something wrong with the blocks themselves.
Right.
It's like that
Yeah.
doesn't, you know.
Yeah, I love that analogy. It's like, well, is it fair to assume that it's the blocks that have a defect, or maybe
Right.
just the brother that keeps on coming and knocking it down?
Right. It's like, well, maybe it's like the entire rest of the world fucking attacking the shit out of this thing and making sure
Just
that it,
maybe.
it never happens. Even like your example of them like eradicating the developmentalism in
Hmm.
in Asia and Africa. It's like we don't even want like a budding of this to
Hmm.
start. You know what I mean? So it's just like, yeah, yeah, I don't know, it just really is frustrating to me.
Hmm. Totally. So let's talk about proposed solutions.
All right.
When I was doing some research for this episode, I sort of broke it down into two sections, like one that is more like solutions from within the system and how we can help alleviate this shit show, and then more just conceptual, I guess, tips or things that I think about in terms of how to emancipate ourselves from capitalism. So, in the podcast that I was mentioning before, Jason Hickel, an economist, was suggesting some of what he thought were the most important structural adjustments that needed to take place. He mentioned debt, like complete debt cancellation, or at least if it's not debt cancellation, like a massive resistance to pay them. And also, number two would be democratizing institutions like the World Trade Organization to radically alter the trading structure of the way that our capital flow exists today. And also a fair international wage system, so implementing a global minimum wage. And he said that this could actually be very easily done through the UN by the International Labor Association. And for example, he suggested that all the minimum wages, that like every country's minimum wage should be 50% of the country's medium wage, because that would pretty much eradicate working poverty overnight. Because right now we have laborers competing with each other on all sides of the world to drive their own wages down. Basically, that's what they have to do under like capitalist wage labor. And so, implementing such a policy that the wage actually cannot be driven down more than 50% of the country's median wage makes a lot of sense, I feel like, and could actually be feasibly done very quickly. And really realizing that collective solidarity needs to be emphasized before personal responsibility, and organizing collectively so that like these wages can't be driven down like this in the first place. A lot of these structural policies that I'm suggesting and that he mentioned on the podcast like amounts to freeing ourselves from this false narrative of aid and development and of the hardworking North and like the poor and competent South. I just really can't stress enough how important I think that is in order to like envision something different, to realize that like capitalism is not just like an inevitability. It isn't just like this invisible force that's just mathematically governing our economy. It's like a system of control that is deliberately administered to keep certain people rich and to make more and more people poor,
Yeah, absolutely. I really love the idea of like democratizing our global institutions. I think that would make a huge difference. Like imagine if the African nations and poor developing nations around the world actually had the same, voting power as every other country, like as the US, as all the Western countries. Like they would have never voted for all of these structural adjustment programs. Never.
Ever.
Never. So yeah, I think that is something to think about going forward, because we do live in a globalized world right now, and we can't just build something that is disconnected from the rest of the world. I mean, countries that are trying to do that within this global system are definitely struggling because they don't have anyone to trade with. They're stuck. So we do need to think about like more international solutions. So I think, democratizing our global institutions is a great thing. Of course, like we definitely would have to go further because this is like still within the overarching mode of production of capitalism. I just want to briefly define the different modes of production, like socialism, communism, and anarchism as the most common alternatives that people talk about. There are definitely more, which we're not going to go into today, but these are kind of just like the main ones. So, as opposed to capitalism, socialism is a mode of production based on collective ownership of the means of production and distribution of goods and services, where there would be no ruling class that leeches profit off of the labor of others. So, the workers themselves would democratically make decisions around what to produce and how. And basic necessities for survival, like food, healthcare, education, etc., are organized as universal rights. And without the extreme inequality that leads so many people to take like whatever low paying job that they can get just to survive, people would be free to pursue their highest potential. Like this is in theory.
Mm-hmm.
Communism is a socialist system, but it goes even further. So it's communal ownership of the means of production, communal property, but it's also like it's a stateless, classless, and moneyless society where production and distribution are based around people's abilities and needs. So, in other words, people contribute to society according to their abilities and they receive according to their need. So, just in case people think that communism is like some violent dictatorship, like this is what it means. It's a mode of production, and I don't think we've ever seen a stateless, classless, moneyless society like in the 20th 21st century. So no, we have not seen communism. We have seen socialism, different forms of socialism, but communism has not been seen. I think that's one of my biggest pet peeves, where people don't actually understand what communism is and they just like
Do you want to explain the main difference?
well, socialism can take a number of forms as well. Doesn't necessarily have to look one way, but like socialism is, people describe it as kind of like the lower stage of communism, or as trying to organize things in an anti-capitalist way, and the end goal is communism, which is a stateless, classless, moneyless society. But yeah, like that's I guess basically the difference between socialism and communism. So yeah, I just want to make that very clear for people who are thinking that communism is a particular thing. Similarly, anarchism, it's similar to both in terms of its, communal decision making, communal ownership of the means of production. It's not based around private property. However, production and distribution are organized through voluntary associations and non-hierarchical forms of governance. And often decision making is organized through direct democracy. So people are democratically deciding on things like together at all times. It's not representative democracy where you elect someone who then makes the decisions for you. It's everyone's involved in all the decisions. I think a lot of them stress like consensus-based forms of decision making. So yeah, I just wanted to make clear, like, these are the ideas of the different alternatives, and then we as people wanting to build these alternatives today have to, I mean, first of all, have a solid analysis, like a solid Marxist or critical analysis of capitalism today and the problems that we're facing today and the structures that are preventing us from reaching equality or free healthcare or free this and that. So we have to start with that, which is what I think Maureen and I are trying to do on our channels and like with this podcast and everything. And then we have to take a look at, okay, how can we organize air travel in a socialized way? How can we organize all these things in ways that are decommodified, democratic, and actually are there to serve the people and not to serve profit for capitalists? So this can take any number of forms, right? And we have seen a number of different attempts at different forms. I mean, there's the Zapatistas, there's so many different examples throughout history of people trying different things, and certain ideas work very well, certain ideas are maybe less desirable, but we have a lot to work with.
Yeah.
I just think we don't do a good enough job at embracing that uncertainty.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of great ideas that can be extrapolated from these systems or from these ways of like relating to each other in these modes of production that you've described under communism and anarchism. Like there's so many ideas that I want to take forward and like definitely implement them as part of like the new plan. Like the idea of being anti-authoritarian and like radically against hero worship. I don't want like one person, and notably one white cis like rich man governing like whatever this laminated blueprint will look like. I like the idea of like being self-sustainable and like producing locally, having no currency, like no arbitrary socially constructed currency that governs like how resources are allocated and how like capital actually flows, but instead have a system that's premised on like material goods that people actually need to survive. And yeah, like I also have a lot of ideas about like incarceration and being anti-incarceration, and everything that you said about a model that would be based on like cooperation rather than competition. So yeah, those are like conceptual ideas. And then as you said, there are plenty of experiments that have been done around the world like very successfully that we can learn from, like the Zapatistas, or like currently, at least I know all over Europe, I don't know what it's like in other places of the world, but there are militant occupations going on that are usually set up to physically halt the development of corporate projects. Like in France, there is something called the Zone à Défendre in right near Nantes, basically because there was an airport that needed to be built, and people were like, fuck no, and they organized and they basically like appropriated the land, and there's like over 200 people living there now. And you know, it's hard, and resistance isn't all like, you know, rainbows and flowers, but they're living there and they don't have money and they're producing food, and they're making it, you know, and arguably a lot more than people in other parts of the country that are like being crushed by wage labor and neoliberalism and poverty. There's also the No TAV movement in Italy, which was a militant occupation of I think a train station or like a new railway that was going to be built. I've also talked a bit on my channel about the Argentinian worker-owned factory movement that started after like the crisis of the financial crisis in 2001, where basically all these factories shut down and the workers like occupied the bankrupt businesses and like reappropriated the means of production and made it like radically anti-hierarchical. Like it's pretty amazing. Basically they have to not establish like a hierarchy in the way that the factory works. They change positions every like month or so. Maybe it's like 6-month rotations. I'm sure that every factory has their own way of doing it, but like 6-month rotations where like one person, like there's not one person who's always the janitor and one person who's always the CEO, you know, they're all like capacitated to take on and understand these different positions, and like all decisions of the factory are made collectively, and they've had like a lot of success with it. And yeah, it's still like going on today in Argentina. So anyway, like these are just like some ideas. I think worker-owned factories and businesses where the workers actually own the means of production is like super important. So yeah, but I think in general, just embracing the idea that other systems are possible, the idea of like embracing confusion. I read an article by Afko in her book Afroism that really resonated with me, where she was describing how badly activists need to like reject certain labels and just like embrace confusion in general. And I wrote down a few of the quotes because they really resonated with me. So she was talking about like people who ask questions like, you know, but another system isn't possible, or like what or like, well, what do you just want, like communism then and everyone to die or whatever? And she said, you know, though these questions, or she wasn't referring exactly to these questions, I forget what they were, but they were in the same vein. And she said, though these questions are frustrating, they demonstrate how people are colonized by the mainstream system to the extent they can't even imagine new possibilities for themselves. And further in the essay, she says, confusion is usually a symptom of decolonizing yourself from the mainstream systems. Answers aren't easily laid out in front of you since you're now forced to think critically. And that, yeah, like really just resonated with me. Oh, and she also said, which I thought was a really good point. Like, I think that people accuse me or accuse us of like being in a cult because we're anti-capitalist and we're vegan, and we have these ideas like that equality would actually be good, and it's actually possible to live in a world where everyone has enough to sustain themselves. Like, what a cult we're part of. And she said, if you can't interpret my actions or theory as anything other than cult-like, then maybe you are actually a member of a group with a fixed worldview. And I was like, yes, girl.
Damn. Those are amazing quotes. And yeah, I'm just loving everything that you're saying right now. Because yeah, when you're talking about like the Argentinian movement and all of these things, like all of these resistant movements, like they all look so different from one another. But the point is that people had to get together and think about, okay, what do we want? What do we need? How do we come together and make it happen right now? How do we respond to the needs of the community? What does the community want? How do we, collectively come to decisions that are gonna be good for everyone? Like these are all experiments. And so people who sit back and think like, well, tell me how to do it. And it's like, no, you need to be the one critically thinking about how to do it. You need to be the one thinking, how can we do this? Let me talk with other people about how we can do this. It can't just be like, here it is, follow it. Like,
a laminated blueprint.
Here it is, the laminated blueprint, right? It's just like, well, why don't you tell me what you think would be good to do? You know what I mean? Like, why don't you help contribute to this? Like, we all have to be doing this. We all have to be the inventors here, and we all have to have the courage to actually experiment. And maybe something we try at first will fail, but then we have to think, okay, that didn't work. Now, how can we improve on that? How can we learn from that and go forward? Otherwise, nothing is ever going to change.
And it's not like everyone needs to be a genius and pull this stuff out completely out of nowhere. There's so many initiatives going on. And yeah, as you said, like, I mean, if you're a privileged person, then like support indigenous movements, support like all these movements run by like people of color, other oppressed people that are doing this work already, like it really frustrates me because not only are people who criticize capitalism like often infantilized and seen as unrealistic, but it's also like we're not just saying like in a vacuum, hey guys, you should care about like anti-capitalism, it's bad. It's like there's so many movements of resistance going on all around us that you could support,
Yeah, no, 100%.
And even though sometimes I'm like negative or sometimes frustrated, I really do believe in what I mentioned earlier in the podcast, that like capitalism's dictatorship over our imagination is faltering by the day. Yeah, maybe this is just like because I'm in leftist circles and whatever, but I feel like we're just reaching such absurd levels of inequality, and also just I don't think that many people actually so some people are frustrated that we criticize capitalism and we still get some pushback from that, but I don't know how many people are actually thinking this is the system that we need and that's going to make the world great.
That's true.
And I feel like the younger generation they were brought up with this idea even less than we were, that like capitalism is great.
Yeah, I mean, and like plus they're like living the fact that it's not great. Like they're living the fact that like I'm not going to live the life that my parents had. I'm not going to buy a house. I'm going to be like struggling to get by, and it's scary. Like it's very scary. But yeah, I just wanted to say, like, going back to when you're like, oh, like you don't have to be a genius, you don't have to be like absolutely brilliant to come up with these things. I was listening to a podcast, Rev Left Radio, and they were talking to I guess some scholars of the Black Panthers, just basically talking about like the Black Panthers and like their movement and what they did. And like a lot, like the leaders of that movement were like in their late teens, early 20s, and what they accomplished was incredible because they actually listened to the community. Like the Black Panthers were of the community, and they set it up so like community members would come to them and say things like, I can't afford this medication, can you get this for me? Or like, white gangs are harassing my parents, or they're harassing us and we need protection, can you provide security? And
Mm,
so they would organize based on the community's needs. So yeah, you don't have to be a genius, you just have to like talk to people
listen.
and
Hmm.
listen and think about like, okay, well, this is not working, these are the people's needs, so let's organize this, right? I mean, you don't have to be a genius, but you have to
Hmm.
understand that what we're doing now doesn't work, and you have to be open to embracing uncertainty and open to trying something different. If you're not open to trying, but I feel like this is all the like quote unquote white moderates who are just like, well, I don't really have to try. Like, I could just keep going the way that we're going and things won't be that bad for me. So why would I embrace uncertainty? You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And yeah, I think that's the kind of like, it's hard to get people to care about things if they're not experiencing them. But I think I think more and more, especially as like automation takes over all of our jobs and like the world becomes even more unequal, fewer and fewer people are going to be in that position to say, well, I don't really have to care about it. Like, there's
Hmm.
going to be more and more people being like, all right, fine, fuck, like, let's organize this now, you know?
Hmm. And understand that these inequalities that are going on like across the world aren't just happening because of scarcity or because of some inevitable like law that we need to compete and be the best, but that things are this way by design,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like the design and the rules of the game that need to be altered and need to be like critically engaged with.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like one of the most successful wars that capitalism has waged is the war against our imagination. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's so many days where I feel like, yeah, and I truly can't imagine the end of the world before I imagine the end of communism, the end of capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I forget like who exactly said that, but it's really really easy and becoming easier by the day to imagine how capitalism is gonna like blow us up. I mean, it's as easy
Mm-hmm.
as like imagining a nuclear confrontation right now between
Mm-hmm.
North Korea and between the United States, or all the wars that are going to, all like the water and food shortages that we're going to be experiencing. And I mean, yeah, I can really fucking easily see how capitalism is going to blow us up, but it is trickier to understand and really like conceive of how the world isn't going to end before capitalism does, and how we're going
Mm-hmm.
to reorganize ourselves differently.
I mean, we're almost kind of taught to think that way. Like, we're almost kind of taught to be like completely cynical and like perversely obsessed with our own
Yes.
demise. Like, think about how many blockbuster films are out there about like
Mm-hmm.
catastrophe and the end of the world and like 2012 and everything is, the day after tomorrow, like, oh my God, the world strikes back and we die, right? Like, we're
Yes.
almost like taught to just like cynically be like, yep, that's the way the world's going. We are taught to be like that so that we
We
don't
are.
do anything to fix it before it's too late. And it's like, that's
Yeah.
really fucked up. Like,
Yeah. It's true. This self-destructive like way of thinking is all around us, and it very much like structures the way we think about the world. I feel like young people and perhaps older people too. I should stop referring to myself as just a young person because I'm not that young anymore.
yeah.
But we're taught to think of ourselves and how much we're overworked and how much we have to be productive when we don't sleep and blah blah blah. There's almost like there's this aesthetic to being super self
Hmm.
destructive
Hmm.
and just working ourselves to the bone. And if you're not miserable or overstressed or having to drink 10 cups of coffee and barely sleeping and being as productive as possible, like there's something, like you're lazy or there's something wrong with you. And I swear to God, resisting that is like my number one 2018 resolution, is to do things that aren't aimed towards making me more productive. Like my
Hmm.
resolutions are literally like, okay, I'm starting to learn the guitar. I want to read more fiction because
Hmm.
I feel like all I read is nonfiction and stuff that like I'm genuinely interested in for sure, but that have this almost like this yield later on to make me have like better arguments or to
Yeah.
make me understand the world better. Like it's not just enjoying the moment like I would if I was reading fiction and I was like, well, I just want to spend time with these characters or have this experience by myself. It's like, well, yeah, I want to learn about this, but also, I don't know, I feel like I feel like it's this exercise in resisting capitalism for me to read fiction like 30 minutes a day, you know?
Absolutely.
I want to sleep more. I want to take an intro to acting class. Like, I want to challenge myself to do these things, because otherwise this ideology of compulsive productivity really does take over your life if you're not careful.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I have not read a fiction book in like 10 years. Like I've
Oh,
read like one
yeah,
fiction book. Like and
right.
I read a lot. Like I have all these books here. I have a
Me
stack of books
too.
that I haven't even read yet that I've already ordered that I'm like, "Oh, these are must reads." And they're
Mm-hmm.
all like academic nonfiction.
Yeah. I mean, I'm reading this book right now by Alice Munro, that one of my best friends recommended to me. And it's just like a collection of short stories, and it's amazing. But I have
Mhm.
to challenge myself literally at night
Mhm.
to not, sometimes I'm like, oh, I kind of just want to put this down and like start this other book that I have right now called Seven Cheap Things of Capitalism, or I forget what, it looks amazing. But I'm like,
Mhm.
God damn it, Marie. No, it is 12:30. Like, you're relaxing in bed. You are allowed to read this short story. And my attention span is not like trained to focus on just like pure
I
enjoyment
know.
that doesn't have like a productive yield.
Yeah, I know. It's so fucked. But you're so right. Like, how many conversations do you have where it's just like, "Oh, how are you?" And you're like, "Oh, I'm
Yeah.
exhausted. Like, I'm
Yeah.
just like, oh, I'm like spread too thin right now. Oh my God, I
Yeah.
can't wait. I always say this. I'm like, I can't wait for the end of this month where like I'll finally have some time. And then the end of the month comes, I'm like, well, okay, I can't wait for like just a few weeks from now. I'll have some time. I'll have some time.
Yeah.
I'm just like, like I feel like I'm like running on the treadmill and just like I imagine myself just like tripping and just falling face down and like having the treadmill just like suck me and like fly me off the back of it. Like that's like me
Hmm.
constantly. Um,
Yeah. And so many people have to, again, like, I'm thinking, wow, I this conversation is also symptomatic of our privilege, that we can just imagine, or not of our privilege, and that I think that everyone wants to have more downtime, but that I can take on these things, that
mhm,
hopefully, I'm not working three different jobs. I'm not like under
mhm,
threat of getting evicted. I'm not having to like feed a family of five.
mhm,
So yeah, I'm not saying that every single person can take these resolutions,
mhm, yeah.
but
Well, under capitalism they can't, which is why we need an
right.
alternative.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think just the pressure of even being like, oh, it doesn't mean that I'm like super lazy and have no aspirations if I actually want to like sleep
Mhm.
8 hours a night and perhaps read a short story before I go to sleep.
Exactly. Or do like anything else that's not related to work or to, I don't know. But I guess
Right.
like we're also activists. So like when we do have spare time off work, a lot of it is like, okay, well, we want to be good in our activism, which
I'm
is
like, okay, I'm
hard.
going to brainstorm. But
Yeah,
yeah.
which is hard. Um,
Hmm. Speaking of which, I need to go to work in 5 minutes.
oh, really?
I do. Yeah, at 4:20.
So yeah, I guess I just kind of wanted to give just a final thought that like, yeah, we need to be the authors of our own future. We need to be doing the critical thinking. We need to be doing the experimentation. And that I think it has to kind of be like we have to attack the structures that be and like you said, think about structural changes that we can do right now across the world that would help to democratize things and would help poor people, but we also
Hmm.
have to build from the bottom up. And so I feel like there are ways to productively combine different anarchist ideas, different communist ideas, different
Hmm.
socialist ideas. I don't think it has to look any one way. And I think that, yeah, I think that we need to start work from the bottom up and the top down, I guess. So there's your
Totally.
blueprint, everybody.
There's your blueprint. Our blueprint message is figure out your own blueprint.
Yeah, there you go.
Hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I think that like having one label, like being a certain type of anarchist or being a certain type of, I mean, because I think that you get this question too, but I always get asked like what my
Hmm.
particular ideology is,
Hmm.
as like an activist or an anti-capitalist advocate. But I think that labels fundamentally like restrict our ability to imagine something, and also like then we become more committed to the label itself and to that ideology
Hmm.
than like we're just adhering to another social construct instead of focusing on like the actual material shit that needs to be organized
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
our life or in
Yeah.
society.
Yeah, David Harvey said something about like understanding these different ideas, understanding these the different proposals made by like different ideologies is important, but dogma is not. Like dogma doesn't serve us.
I
And I
love
just feel
that.
like, yeah, absolutely. Like I really don't care about what label. I really just care about like let's be imaginative and let's work on this together. So I don't know, whatever.
Well said.
Yeah, we also wanted to say that we actually do have a bunch of reviews on iTunes. So thank you so much. I didn't see them because iTunes does this really ridiculous thing where it only shows you reviews from people from your own country. So I have my country set to Canada and we have no Canadian reviews. But when I changed it to American, we have like a bunch of reviews. We have like 21 ratings and a bunch of reviews, and then we also have some from
That's
like
amazing.
the UK and in Europe and things like that. So thank you, everyone. We're sorry that we kept saying that we had no reviews, and like we
Although it was getting kind of fun week after week.
Yeah.
Me just being like, do we have one yet? And you just being like, no.
Yeah, no, we have a lot. So thank you so much.
That's so wonderful.
And we also had some very generous pledges this past few weeks. So on Patreon, as one of our monthly donors, Helena, sorry, again, I'm not sure how they pronounce their name, but they increased their pledge very generously. So thank you so much. And we also had a very generous one-time donation from Joseph Gardner. So thank you so much, Joseph. We really appreciate that. We're trying to save up for some new equipment and perhaps to put the show out at a greater frequency, like once per week instead of once every couple of weeks. So all of your donations and pledges really, really matter. So we very much appreciate them. If you'd like to support the show, you can support us on Patreon, becoming a monthly donor, or you can make a one-time donation via PayPal on our website, which is veganvanguardpodcast.com.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so thank you for listening.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye.